Oh, you know what? Yes, please, thank you. I haven't got it turned up yet. Okay, well, let's give it a try.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Wright, and I'm the General Manager of Waterloo Global Science Initiative. I'd like to welcome you to the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics. We'd like to acknowledge that we have gathered on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The Perimeter Institute is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. I also want to acknowledge the importance of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, a peace agreement made between Indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and Mother Earth, and we should take only what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. By acknowledging this covenant and the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, we are reminded of our important work in connecting to this land where we learn and work. Welcome to all. Waterloo Global Science Initiative is a joint venture of Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics and the University of Waterloo. We are a catalyst for collective action on complex global issues. Through local and global collaborations, we create the conditions where big picture conversations happen, and then we offer the space and time for people to act on that change. This morning, we concluded our Generation SDG Summit, which focused on developing strategic pathways for community-led implementation of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In the coming year, WGSI will release a highly detailed blueprint document that builds on the communiqué. This document provides the steps to convert vision into reality in practical and scalable ways. As we round out our summit programming, we wanted to follow up on an important question that's receiving a lot of attention in Canada right now. How will we fund the SDGs? Our moderator for this closing panel was involved in our very first summit, Energy 2030, which took place in 2011. I keep bumping into him in the oddest places, and we finally decided a few weeks ago to have a proper reunion. Nicholas Parker has pioneered sustainable venturing ideas and initiatives around the world for over 3 decades. He's currently chairman of Parker Venture Management, through which he makes catalytic investments and provides strategic advisory services, particularly to private wealth holders. He's also managing partner of Global Acceleration Partners, a financial enterprise accelerating cross-border deployment of technologies and business models into emerging economies to achieve exponential impact against major sustainability challenges. In 2002, Nick coined the term clean tech, as he was co-founding Clean Tech Group, a market-leading research and advisory company that he chaired until the end of 2013. Under his leadership, Clean Tech Group helped create a global ecosystem, mobilized over $6 billion in private equity, and convened thousands of decision makers. Nick has served on a number of advisory boards, including the Singapore Economic Development Board, Ontario Premier's Climate Change Advisory Panel, Centre of Excellence for Commercialization of Research, and the Clinton Global Initiative, where he was Principal Energy and Climate Advisor. Thanks for joining us today, Nick.
Thanks very much, Julie. It's great to be here in Waterloo at the Perimeter Institute, and welcome to everybody who's joined us live or is live streaming. We have an all-star panel, and it's my pleasure as your immoderate moderator to curate this conversation for the next hour. Before I introduce my panelists, my fellow panelists, I'd like to try and sort of set up the conversation a little bit. The conversation is about finance and the SDGs. And when we think finance, today many of us use the language of impact investing. All finance has impact one way or another, So ultimately, all finance is relevant to this conversation. Secondly, on the SDGs, this is the blueprint that the world has agreed to for the problems we can and must and will solve in the next 15 years. By sheer scale of what we're talking about, the SDGs are commonly referred to as requiring $5 to $7 trillion a year to bring them to life and to achieve them. At the same time, the SDGs are considered a $12 to $20 trillion market opportunity. That's a lot of capital, a lot of finance. Within the SDGs, you can unpack around any number of things that we want to solve for. If it's climate change, we need many billions and trillions to bring the clean energy that we all need and want. But at the same time, repurposing carbon is considered a $1 trillion market opportunity. Sitting here now with my panelists, looking out on the audience, which is mainly millennials, I realize that we're going to be transferring to you globally between $50 and $60 trillion over the next 30 years. So this is a chance to reset the operating system of capitalism, the capital markets. And in doing so, I think what we're going to do for the next hour is we're going to play trustees of that 60 trillion that's about to be transferred. Are we worthy of being trustees? If we were trustees of 60 trillion over the next 30, 40 years, what would we do with it? So without further ado, let me introduce my fellow panelists. On my immediate left, Stephen Huddart is the CEO of the McConnell Foundation based in Montreal. And McConnell is the largest private foundation operating nationally in Canada, and who've made a fabulous journey over the last 20 years in learning how to be more effective in the community and building the world that we want. I'll let Stephen explain more of that to me. Sitting on Stephen's immediate left is Jennifer Reynolds, recently appointed CEO of the Toronto Financial Services Alliance, and before that, CEO of Women in Capital Markets. To her left, we have Robert Greenhill, who's based in Montreal, and I should say without, obviously, that Jennifer is based in Toronto. From Montreal, in Montreal is Robert Greenhill, who is CEO of Global Canada Initiative, pardon me. And prior to that, Robert has an esteemed career both with the World Economic Forum, where he held a very senior position, and before that, president of Canada's aid program, as it was formerly known, CEDA, and with a long history also in the private sector with Bombardier and McKinsey. And then last but definitely not least, at the end of our group of people we have here today, is Carol Ann Hilton, who is the CEO of Indigenomics Institute, fabulous name for an organization, originally from BC, and is a First Nation person herself, and will bring a perspective on all of this topic. So if we're starting out here to reset the capital markets so that they're purpose-built to achieve our 17 SDG goals, then what is the size of the opportunity here, and why now? And what are the key trends and challenges that each of my panelists are seeing? So I'm going to ask you, Robert, perhaps with the most global of global views, to kick us off with your own thoughts, and feel free to put a bit more color on what you're up to in Montreal.
Well,
Thanks.
thank you, Nick, and thank you for everyone who's participating in this. I think it is worth just noting just what an incredible opportunity it is. And the opportunity of the SDGs isn't just across these 17 goals, specific metrics. It's a chance to transform the human condition, to actually eliminate avoidable maternal deaths, to eliminate avoidable child deaths, and to do it in a way that's more equitable, so we actually have not only a more prosperous, but a much more just world than we've literally ever experienced. That's the human opportunity. The challenge and also the opportunity is how do we apply capital to meet those goals? And I'll disaggregate in Canada and outside of Canada. In Canada, we have the capital. We have trillions of dollars that are available to be invested. The issue is, can you align those finances with the needs of the SDGs? Partly that'll be an issue of regulation around climate change and other elements. Partly, though, it'll be based on the imagination and thoughtfulness of key executives that are looking at financing opportunities. And partly it'll depend on the actions of the consumer citizens, who by the choices they make affect what companies invest in. The new barricades for this revolution are actually the store shelves that people shop in. And if they decide to purchase a Unilever product because Paul Polman is truly walking the talk in terms of sustainable development, that actually has a ripple effect across all sorts of investment decisions. So that's the element at the domestic level. Internationally and for developing countries, it isn't the context as Canada. There is not the capital required to simultaneously meet basic human needs, build the social and physical infrastructure the country needs, and also deal with issues such as the impact of potential climate change and so on. So in that case, the challenge is, can we be more creative in terms of bringing in the right capital? Part of that will be the private sector that has a role to play internationally in certain infrastructure and other projects in developing countries. Partly there'll be element of blended finance. We have public and private groups working together to reduce risk, to provide sufficient returns to so-called crowd in the private sector. But a lot of it will depend upon us sustaining for at least the next 10 to 15 years the level of generosity that previous generations of Canadians and others have exhibited towards so-called developing countries, to actually provide them with the capital they need through official development assistance or philanthropy, to actually allow them to invest in making sure that basic human needs are addressed, to build the governance systems they need, to put in place the social infrastructure of education and healthcare for all these other instruments of capital to come into play. I guess what I would say in conclusion, and we'll look at some of the different instruments, there's no magic bullets in terms of how to do this. In every case, if one finances, either it is provided concessionally through philanthropy or official development assistance, or it needs a return. The opportunity is, can we be more creative and courageous in how we actually apply that capital to not just deal with the symptoms of problems, but to actually deal with their root causes, so that people not only have a return financially, but we actually have a return that we're providing to the next generation, as I said, a more prosperous and equitable world than we have ever seen.
Thanks very much, Robert. Jennifer, do you want to pick up on that and follow through?
Sure. I guess I'll pick up on it from the perspective of, being the financial person here. This is a huge economic opportunity. It's a huge opportunity for the financial sector here in Canada and in other countries. You mentioned some of the numbers earlier. Numbers I got were 90 trillion over the next 15 years to finance this. If you think about green infrastructure requirements, that's another 6 trillion there. So the financial community has to make that happen. To come up with that. So that's a huge opportunity for us. And so I've spent some time internationally recently with a group of, it's an international network of financial centers for sustainable finance. So there are people actually thinking about this out there. And I will say some are further ahead than Canada perhaps on some of these initiatives. But thinking about what do we need to do within our financial centers and within the financial community to move this agenda forward, to meet these targets. And what we're seeing is some of the financial centers, certainly in Europe, are further ahead than us in terms of, we need a national plan here. What does this look like if we're actually going to get there? What types of things do we need to be doing? And just to give you a few examples of things that the financial community is thinking about, disclosure is a big one. Our insurance companies are already dealing with this. They already have to be sophisticated about their risk models and understanding climate risk, because it's a huge number. I mean, it was 200 billion was the claims last year, and Canada alone, 5. If we do nothing, the estimate that I've seen is do nothing, the cost in Canada alone would be about 21 to 43 billion. So the insurance industry has to think about this. And unfortunately, I think in Canada we are it's in the banks and the pension funds. This is also at the forefront. So number one, are we actually disclosing to investors these risks appropriately? That's something we are thinking about in Canada. There's actually an expert panel just announced by the federal government around, we need to think about this, and there'll be some announcements in the fall around G7 on that. That initiative, just so people know, emanated from discussions which the financial community pushed forward with both Minister McKenna and Morneau to make sure that we were thinking about this. They recognized we got to be coordinated. We're doing things in little pockets. What's the coordinated plan here? So disclosure is certainly a key element we need to think about. The contentious one is around fiduciary duty. So if you're a pension fund, how much do you take into your calculations the risk of climate in that? And that's a very difficult one right now. And I think everyone's at a different place on how we're going to get there and how does that transition happen. I think certainly there's huge opportunities around the green bond market. It's grown tremendously, up to about 150 billion last year globally. We in Canada are small. We have a very emerging market, hopefully, of about 4 or 5 billion. But there's a big opportunity there for the financial community to step up. We have a lot of investment required in green infrastructure here in Canada. So my view is, and other financial centers around the world are already thinking about this, how can we be the experts here? How do we become, whether it's London or Luxembourg, how are we going to be the experts where all those green bond financings are happening? Well, why can't Toronto be that center here in North America? So we need to start thinking about these types of things within the financial sector, and we are. And so I think developing this national strategy and thinking about how are we going to move the economy forward on this front to a lower emissions is critical. So that's just sort of a general lay of the land, I think, of where we're at today in the financial community.
Well, great start. Robert, if I can, summarize in a word, blending, public-private partnerships. Jennifer already starting on the disclosure, which leads to the way the table is set and where capital will inevitably flow. Let's bring you in, Stephen, and then Caroline. How are you seeing the opportunities and what are the big trends that are out there for you?
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers and the hosts and to the First Nations who've stewarded these lands for millennia. This is the size of this opportunity is the size of the whole systems that we live in. It's the size of all the money in the world and where it's invested that has produced exactly what we have now, and where, from a philanthropic perspective, we see opportunities for catalytic action by philanthropies. But more broadly, I think this is a call to civil society to organize, to align, and to orient efforts to achieving social, economic justice. And I think in the Canadian context, it's important to highlight reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I'll leave this to Carol Ann, but I think it's acknowledged generally that the SDGs do not specifically speak to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples as an important or as a named element, but clearly in Canada we have to interpret this call that way, and so I'm looking forward to Carol Ann's remarks. The role of the philanthropic sector is both to convene and grant, but also to invest. And so the field of impact investing has emerged in part in Canada from philanthropic organizations, including McConnell and others. The Mars Centre for Impact Investing and Purpose Capital are really some of the early pioneers in creating this field or this marketplace where we are essentially de-risking situations for larger or more senior levels of investment from the private sector and the public sector. But in this work, it's pretty clear, I think, that philanthropy and civil society cannot do this. We can't do this on our own. So the first place I think we have to be, and we are building new relationships, is with the public sector. I happen to sit on a panel organized by under ESDC, the Minister Duclos, on social innovation and social finance. Our report will be delivered to the government in June, and which really calls for a resetting of the relationship between civil society and the public sector broadly. We're both here for the public good, or for the greater public good. We can and should align our efforts more intentionally so as to reduce some of the transactional costs and to direct funds to those places in our country where they are needed and to those economic situations that are ready for transformation. I think this is a critical point to make. Civil society provides the social context for the transformation that we have to go through. We're talking today about the financial system, but clearly there is a social context for that and the the environmental transformation that we have to go through. So if this is broadly could be described as a socio-technical transformation that society has to navigate over the next decade, civil society's role is essential, and we have to invest in it. And that's happening. I'm happy to say that Alliance 2030 has come together, which brings together Community Foundations of Canada with CCIC, the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, as well as IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and other partners. And so civil society is organizing itself to mobilize around the goals across the country into every part of the country, and that's a critical conditioning factor for the successful deployment of capital into society for this transformation. So it's a huge task, and while we tend to think about this in terms of sustainability and environmental sustainability and climate change, that's critical, we also have to think about the transformation of our social systems. We waste huge amounts of time, talent, and treasure on social systems. Our correction system would be one. We've got too many people locked away, unproductive, not engaged, not contributing, not learning, and so on. We can transform these systems. We know how to do it, but we need capital to move into this space. So I'll just finish up by saying in the social sector, we're used to the grant economy and those grants and contributions from government, a little bit from philanthropy, that enable the operating budgets to be adjusted up or down 2, 3, 4, 5%. And we're also pretty good at marshalling capital from private sources and public sources to build buildings like this one, university campuses and so on. But what we don't have and what we need urgently is capital to fund systemic change. So where we can generate better outcomes for people and prove that using data and evidence and experimentation and social R&D, that's where we need to be putting pools of capital to work for this transition to happen. So it's something that will be coming out of the recommendations from the federal panel I said on. We need a capital fund that provides patient, long-term investment capital to put to work in transforming these social systems. So,
super, thank you. Yeah. So if I can summarize you in a nutshell, I would say intention times innovation for social capital formation.
I like that.
Okay,
put that on my business card.
Yeah. Caroline, thanks for waiting. Please join the conversation.
Thank you. And thank you for the acknowledgements of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people here. As with that reality of that acknowledgement, that protocol of the original people from here, it's important that that distinction is both a relationship to the land here and a relationship to the people. And it's in that framework that the original songs, the original dances, the original ceremonies, the language of here, the treaty of here, all carry with them the potential of this alternative Indigenous worldview. It's this alternative, parallel Indigenous worldview that runs straight through the center of this room, that runs right through the center, that acknowledges a difference in perception of the concept of capital, that runs through the concept of the difference in understanding the formulation of wealth across time in relationship to each other. My work in the Indigenomics Institute, which I've just recently established, is really around understanding that there's an alternative Indigenous worldview, that it relates directly to economics, that it relates directly to the wealth and prosperity of this world and how we experience it. In establishing the Indigenomics Institute, what was important to me was to put that first in a Canadian context, to understand that the current value of an Indigenous economy here in Canada is $32 billion. That's a rudimentary number, but my work through the Indigenomics Institute is how do we create leadership and form the narrative around the potential of a $100 billion Indigenous Canadian economy. If we can do that here within Canada, we can look at what does that mean? We hear that so often, that concept of closing the gap. When we hear that concept of closing the gap, it's this actual facilitation of, well, this is awkward. As an economic function of closing the gap, that's really what the Sustainable Development Goals are doing. So the experience, who is experiencing the other side of the development. That's really the parallel that needs to be identified. The experience of underdevelopment, the experience of development, and the achievement of development requires innovation. It will require innovation within our human relationships. It will require innovation in how we understand who made the rules, how we experience the rules, how the rules change, and essentially from what worldview is that creation of what development and the application of that can look like. So in the work that I see, I've been on the Canadian Economic Growth Council now for the past couple years, and really seeing what the concept of economic inclusion can mean, of what that means for what we say Canada's middle class. The concept of that was economics from the home, from the ability to say, look at infrastructure, look at participation in the experience of economic growth. I think the parallels between economic growth and the Sustainable Development Goals need to be brought closer together. The human experience, or that human condition that you spoke to, that is really the center point that we can look at innovation within finance, we can look at innovation within markets, we can look at innovation, but really the human condition, the underlying theme across all of those is inclusion, is participation. So my work with Indigenomics is largely around who is at the table, who is making decisions. This country has moved towards a new era. The ability for this government to say recognition as a framework, as a new tool of working with Indigenous peoples, what that actually means in terms of that being facilitated is the establishment of jurisdiction. What do I mean by jurisdiction? The ability to understand the function of a national economy and what that relates to for Indigenous peoples, of how we get to resources to market, what that relationship in the legal and economic environment is here, again, is all then experienced within the Sustainable Development Goals. I look at the reserve system, and I call that the underdevelopment of the reserve. If we take a cold, hard truth stop look at the reserve system, what we see is a microcosm for the potential of the Sustainable Development Goals. When we see that as a microcosm, it's uncomfortable. So the ability to say, how can we be comfortable with the leadership and the requirement to match finance to development, to human condition, and to be inclusive? That's really the trend that I see, as well as a return to responsibility. If we look at the sections or the fractions of concepts of new economy that really we see green or sharing or different aspects of that, that's really a return to human values, and that is what is emerging. So a return to responsibility and a return to relationship within how we're approaching these. Thank you.
Super. Well, I guess I'm going to have to summarize you as much as everybody else. So I would say what you're saying is what are the values behind what we value and how we create value. And if I may just stay with this for a second, Caroline, do you think not only just for the benefit of Indigenous people in Canada, but more broadly within society and Indigenous people around the world, do you think there's a way in which Indigenous people would apply investing that gives advantage or is more holistic or otherwise than what you're seeing currently in the mainstream? Do you think there's an approach that would be beneficial? And by extension, Jennifer, I'm going to come to you on women in capital markets, because the evidence, at least with women that I've seen, is that if you apply a gender lens, you may be actually accruing an unfair advantage in the sense that women perhaps invest better and women-backed enterprises perform better. So Caroline, just to stay with you on this for a second, how would you respond to that question?
My response would be the application of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is a pathway for investability. It de-risks because it allows a proper pathway to a relationship that's based on recognition, that's based on inherent rights. And for my own people, I'm from the Newtownth area. Last week, we just won a court case that essentially said we have a right to a commercial fishery. We live in a country for the past 8 years, Canada has said, as Indigenous people, we do not have a modern right to an economic function. We had to win that in court. Now, at that economic table, everybody has to move over. But in that moving over now leaves room for finance. So you look at it within a fishing industry, but it's also happening across other industries. And the ability to see that recognition implemented into relationships is good for finance, it's good for the economy, and it lays out a pathway for this country based on sustainable development.
Thank you. Jennifer, how would you respond to that from your own perspective?
Well, I think if we're looking at things, you're talking about this transfer of wealth and investment decisions, and where would women put capital in different places than men, perhaps. And there's all kinds of research around this topic, as you alluded to, that actually says women do allocate capital differently. I'll start with research around wealth and investments. Women take a very different perspective on that, and they take a lot longer to make decisions. When they make decisions, they stick with them. They research things really well, they stick with them, they have lower churn in their portfolios, they do have higher returns overall. So they do invest differently. The other way they invest differently is it's shown that they take into greater consideration ESG. And so that goes into their investment decisions. And so I believe if you've got, if you think today, there's women control about 40% of the investable assets. That's only going to increase because women tend to live longer, they're inheriting from their parents, from husbands who pass away. Also, women are wealthier just generally. And so as you see that capital shift, I do believe we're going to see some different investment decisions being made because you've got those people holding the wealth are viewing these things quite differently. So I think it's significant, and I think it offers a huge opportunity. And I think, going back to the discussion around disclosure, that's why disclosure is so important, because people don't even know right now what they're investing in some cases. So that disclosure can become a real competitive advantage for companies, actually.
Right. The numbers I've seen are 2/3 of wealth, financial assets in the United States will be held by women within 15 years.
Yeah.
Robert, just to bring you back in to the conversation, you have such a global view and one that's combined both private and public practice over many years. How do we break out of this sort of constipation that we've gotten, where there's tons of money out there, there's clearly real need and opportunity, we've learned how to do things in a better way, or we're learning, perhaps. What is it going to take for us to unlock this, and what is a particular Canadian element of this that you think we can bring to the table?
Well, it's interesting because there's been work done in Canada for the last several years across two different governments, federally, Liberal and Conservative, around how does one crowd in the private sector to meet social and development goals. So Convergence that was set up in Toronto, a financing facility that's been set up in Montreal to assist this. I think there's certain principles that Stephen was referring to that are important too, and also with this idea that Jennifer was mentioning of the crystallizing some of these issues and putting social and future challenges on corporate balance sheets. This element of can you, through disclosure, bring the future into the present and force decision makers, both politicians and executives, to have to think through what the long-term impact of their actions will be, that will shift tremendous amounts of capital. And the work that Mark Carney has been really championing for the Financial Stability Board, that actually simply says, okay, if you as a company have assets that actually would be stranded assets if they're oil or coal in the future, or if they have some CO2 liability, you have to note that. That actually is a way of unlocking a lot of creativity and a lot of capital to address these challenges. So bringing the future into the present. And the other element is making prevention pay. I mean, in so many cases, it's you fix things after they're broken. Well, what can one do to actually stop them from being broken in the first place? I mean, at a very personal or human level, if a child is born with substance addiction already, it can be very difficult throughout their lives. and they're either neglected or if society tries to help, very expensive. Well, what would it take to truly empower women in terms of the education, the support, the context, the control of their own body and the decision when to become pregnant, so that they are becoming pregnant or choosing to give birth when they are actually ready? That's a very simple notion, but actually, it's amazing how much money is spent on end-of-life medical care. It's horrifying how little is spent on adolescents.
Are you seeing financial innovation or financial solutions being baked around this right now?
We're starting to see this. So this issue of the role of adolescence and adolescent health, because actually, if you look at, we spend a lot of money right in the first couple of years of life, a lot at the end, very little in between, but actually, where a lot of life behaviors are developed, a lot of life decisions are taken, is between the ages of 12 and 18. When the World Health Organization was reviewing in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, how they would be rethinking their universal health, they started to put a light on that. And obviously, contraception and social reproductive health is part of that, but it's also mental health, emotional health, nutrition, safety. So the public sector and civil society is starting to shine a light on that. I can hope and imagine that there will be tremendous problem solving applied to that through social entrepreneurs and others to help unlock that. But actually, if you get that right, if you actually help people in their first steps as adults do it in a healthy fashion with confidence and with the skills they need and the health they'd like to have, you're actually setting them up for the rest of your life, and you're setting up society for the rest. So that's the kind of creative problem solving to kind of bring the future into the present and to make prevention pay that could unlock a lot. And the McConnell Foundation is leading a lot of that kind of thinking in Canada.
Indeed. So, Stephen, you can do what you do, but ultimately we need to bring the mainstream pension funds and so on in the world to the table. And, you know, workers of the world unite. We own the means of production. Right. We own 70–80% of the capital stock of these public companies, but we've got a notion of fiduciary responsibility that historically has inhibited capital from flowing to some of the areas that Robert's just alluded to, and Caroline and Jennifer. What, in your experience, is the conversation you're having with these main institutions? Are they grasping both the scale of the challenge and, more as importantly, are they grasping the scale of the opportunity yet?
Yeah, I think we're right at the cusp of this conversation. It's a very exciting moment in our work. Along with Catherine Brambrick, who's here from the Ontario Trillium Foundation. I've been in a meeting with philanthropic foundation CEOs for the past couple of days, and to hear the conversation around the room, we're all either involved more deeply with impact investing or about to, and having conversations with pension funds, financial institutions, and larger players around some truly catalytic interventions. And it's still small. It's actually, the deal size is not large enough for banks and most credit unions, but we're getting close to that. We've just, in Quebec, with Desjardins, the large credit union group, a couple of pension funds, and CMHC launched an affordable student housing fund, a $10 million fund that's going to build 600 units of affordable student housing. That's still not big enough for a bank to get involved. We need to be in the $50 to $150 million threshold, but we're getting there. And I think some of the work that's been going on for the last 3–4 years among social entrepreneurs in Canada, in the Indigenous innovation economic space, we're seeing a growing chorus of players moving into this space. Remember, we're starting with the grant economy, and the granting economy just doesn't get us all the way, it just gets us to the starting place. But we have a particular role to play in de-risking situations for larger investments. So I think if we look ahead, over the next decade, we're going to be looking for, along with other investors, SDG-aligned funds. I want to put my money to work on oceans, and the financial institution and its partners in civil society and academia and in the public sector that can be there and deliver that are going to do very, very well indeed, both in terms of impact but also in terms of economic well-being. So that's the opportunity. It's huge, and I think, like many of you, a little bit frustrated that financial leadership in this country has not moved ahead quickly enough, that we're playing catch-up. Same thing in the corporate sector, I have to say. I mean, there are lots of great companies in Canada, don't get me wrong, but corporate leadership could be taking advantage of this opportunity to brand Canada, to get in front of some of this, to share what we've got in this country, which is a reasonably equitable, diverse, and successful society that is safe and secure. Those are all values that should be baked into some financial products that we can export and build and co-create with people in developing countries and so on. So there's, I think, an opportunity space in front of us that we're keen to help to fill.
So my sense from hearing the four of you and my own experience and just being a keen observer of all of this stuff is that we're really good at the grassroots innovation in Canada.
Yeah.
We can do some stuff at the ground level, but then you go, what are we doing really at scale, both within the country and abroad? And when you compare us to groups around the world, whether it's the leading institutional investor in Singapore, Temasek, which has this redefined its entire strategy around the SDGs, or a leading company in India like Mahindra, which is similarly falling apart like I am, which is similarly reconstituting its entire business strategy around this, and so on and so forth. Partners Group and UBS in Zurich announcing at Davos $5 billion for impact. I mean, we're not even, we're proud when we put $20 million into a bank-backed fund for impact investing. So what is the delta here? How do we have the creativity, we have the intention, we have the life experience. How do we scale? How do we go from small, from niche to scale? So Caroline, what are your thoughts on this, both for the communities that you're most interested in, but more broadly?
I think that's a beautiful opportunity through the Economic Growth Council that there was an insertion of how do we include the SDGs within that. And it was really, for the people at the table, it was, we don't know how to do that or what that actually looks like. And I think it's the underlying intention or mandate of inclusion that really laid the foundation for what is possible in answering that question.
So we're going to get serious about inclusion. Did we need, I forget which one of us said this, but we need a national vision of this, of where we want to go. And I think Elise Boulding once said, if you don't know where you want to go, how are you going to get there? So it's really sort of having this, curating this into a vision and then putting the capital and human, financial, and other capital behind it. Would that be a fair way of?
And I think it's measuring what's important to you. So the worldview behind the concepts of measuring, the concepts of measurements itself, what specifically is being measured and from what perspective it's being measured from, is an area definitely to look at as for both inclusion, participation, and another way to look at it for innovation.
Thumbs up, thumbs down in terms of the progress we're making right now. Do you feel encouraged or discouraged?
I feel there needs to be more attention to it and more leadership, and there's a lot of room for innovation across industry sectors. I'm right here.
Okay, thanks. Robert, what's your view on this?
I think there's two great opportunities. One is something we haven't mentioned enough yet, is the public pension funds in Canada are world scale and world class. Right. We have over $500 billion in assets. We have world class managers. And many of them really care about these issues. So Mark Wiseman, who is the former head of the Canadian Pension Plan, actually had an influence on BlackRock, where he works now, putting out a note saying that all companies need to lay out what their purpose is in terms of real social impact. And for BlackRock, with trillions in assets, that is huge. There's a little Canadian influence there. The challenge is, can our pension funds, while being responsible fiduciarily, because they need to have the returns, so we all have pensions, can we leverage that? Because that could actually have a national and a global impact. That's one element. The other element is leadership. The people, you mentioned Paul Polman, you mentioned Anand Mahindra. There are individuals who make a difference. And we talk about quotes. There's Margaret Mead's quote of, I'm paraphrasing, don't underestimate the impact a small group of visionaries can have to change the world. Indeed, the world has never been changed any other way. What we actually need in Canada right now, beyond systems and visions and policies, is a dozen or 24 leaders in particularly the corporate and investing community to step up and become champions on this, like Paul Polman has been with Unilever internationally. And a few of those people acting as vanguards would really help accelerate things here. And I think the moment is ripe. We haven't yet seen that happen, but I'm hopeful we will over the next year or so.
So here you are, Jennifer, in Toronto, both Canada losing our place in the world in terms of exports and trade, going down, and similarly with Bay Street gradually losing its competitiveness. Is this the mother of all opportunities? Is this the great reset that Bay Street's got to get behind? Is there any other agenda item that you can have while you're in your current tenure?
Well, I mean, I think number one.
Is the answer in the question?
Yeah, really, exactly. So in
I'm
terms
amping
of,
this up as we go through.
You're perpetuating a myth around our financial sector that we're not a fantastic, large global financial center. We're second largest in North America and seventh globally. So let's go out and trumpet that as Canadians, you know. It's a very important part of our economy. And to your point about the pension funds, they have a huge role in our economy and globally now and are very, very well respected and are thinking about this issue in a big way. I actually feel pretty positive about this because I've spent some time, as I mentioned earlier, over the last 6 months with other financial centers talking about this issue and then coming home and saying, what are we doing? And going around and talking to stakeholders at banks, in insurance companies, in pension funds, and saying, what are you doing? And the good news is people are doing something. They are thinking about this. There is a growing pool of expertise within each of these institutions. So there isn't nothing going on. Is there enough? Of course not. Do we need to do more? Of course. Do we need more leadership? Absolutely. But I do think that we're really seeing that. I think with the groups we've seen come together in the financial sector just in the last couple of months over this issue, that's new. I mean, I think the dialogue even a year ago, very, very different. So I think that's positive. I think we always need to move faster. I think we've seen global peers move faster around these, as I was saying earlier, task forces and thinking about strategy on a national level, or an even larger level if you're thinking about the EU. I think I feel positive. I do think there's a growing recognition that there's a real economic opportunity here. And to your point, is this the next great opportunity? I think it actually could be. I think there's a huge opportunity for Canada to play leadership. And the example I always talk about with people, and maybe this will be an unpopular example right now, but Little Canada, is the center of mining. And we have the most listings of mining companies in Canada. And we developed that not because we had all the mines here. We developed expertise here. So we can certainly do that from the perspective of green finance. Why not go there next?
We also have more clean tech listings on the TSX than any other bourse in the world. Stephen, I'm sure this has provoked you to want to come in on a bunch of things, but I want to challenge you on a particular axis. You've been pioneering and investing in things that were not possible before, and you've seen some of these things fail, I would assume, and learned, and you've seen some things scale and getting ready for prime time now. At the same time in Canada, we have exponential technology. We have things like AI, more AI startups in Canada than Silicon Valley. We're good at blockchain, we're good at genomics, we're good at all this stuff. So you've got social innovation at one end, in which we're learning at the grassroots, and then you've got this exponential technology at the other end.
That's right.
Is there a way to bring this together? And does that make it more backable, more investable?
Right. It's a great question, and it really is something that continues to perplex us, not just at McConnell, but across civil society. We have tremendous reserves of creativity and innovativeness in the social sector, and yet we feel like when the public conversation around innovation is happening, we're forgotten. It's a technical, it's a digital, it's blockchain and so on, but if we don't include the social context for innovation and don't invest in society's abilities to innovate itself out of some of the perplexing situations in which we find ourselves, we're not actually going to make it. We've so trusted and continue to trust the Facebooks of the world that, well, it'll take, technology will take care of everything. It won't. If we don't bring the governance question forward, and I appreciate that CG is here at University of Waterloo, if we don't have those conversations, if we don't have the conversations among leaders in all sectors, private, public, civil society, academic, media, etc., among youth and so on, we're not going to actually have the necessary conditions for the transition that we want to embark on. So I appreciate we have great strengths in the Canadian financial sector, and with many, we invest with them and we appreciate very much what they've accomplished. But if we're not, and technology likewise, but we have to make room for social innovation, I think, to be part of this conversation. So my bad. We haven't done a good enough job of making the case, but I think with the federal panel that I'm part of, and with the growing awareness of Canada's opportunity in this space, we are going to be able to move into a different conversation. But first, we've got to convene leadership around this across sectors. We're not having those conversations yet. And we have to bring this to communities, because that's part of the nature of this transition. It's not just people at the top having a conversation among themselves, it's what we engage our fellow citizens. The civic engagement is critical to the success of this endeavor. So.
It seems to me from what we're saying up here is that we've moved basically from a siloed situation in which things are all separate, and now we've got platforms which in many ways are flatforms. And we actually need to move into a more rounded way of seeing things, a more systemic approach. And whether that's including an Indigenous or a women's-based way of thinking and acting on these sorts of things, or whether it's going through public-private partnerships or bringing the grassroots up together. So what is it we've got to do to get to this more rounded?
So I think it takes a shift in looking at our challenges as opportunities for inclusive growth. As you begin to solve a complex social challenge, you begin to realize that the economic underpinnings, that which holds that problem in place, implies resource commitments and structures which are no longer adaptive. And so as we unpack those through things like social labs or other types of social innovation, we begin to see that actually resources can flow in more productive, generative, and adaptive ways. And I think we learn more about this from working with Indigenous partners on some of those issues than almost anywhere else.
So you're getting the feedback loops that the system as a whole is not getting, perhaps.
Could be, but I think the social lab is an important construct here. Just to take a moment to say that putting in place in communities that are challenged, that are stuck, or around issues that are stuck, multiple perspectives and stakeholder engagement that is facilitated over time enables the system to generate new testable hypotheses for transforming that system. And that's something that universities should be doing more of, is that sort of community-engaged scholarship. It's something that the public sector and philanthropy can spend more time investing in. But we're looking for those investments in capacity to change, as well as the financial flows that would accelerate the transformation we're looking for.
And the check writers at the table so they can learn, let alone participate.
That's right.
I think we've only got a few more minutes, so I'm going to walk down here with all of you and ask essentially the same question. If it's true that we need the system to work more holistically and in a more integrated way, then what is the one thing or one or two things, Jennifer, you're hoping to see, and by extension Robert and Caroline, that would enable the system to function in the way we'd all like to see it?
I think this discussion around long-termism, and the results are, in the corporate world, whether you're a financial services company or any other company, you're judged by the quarter. And that is inconsistent with the things that we're talking about today. And so we need to start thinking about how we incorporate more of that long-termism into our evaluation of performance. And there's a disconnect right now. So it's very hard for a CEO to meet those quarterly objectives and keep shareholders happy, and keep his board happy, and his employees happy and employed, and then also think about long-termism and really what's best for that company, what's best for the industry, what's best for Canada, on the long term. So this discussion has started. You mentioned Mark Wiseman. He's certainly been out speaking on this particular topic. We've got to figure out how we move more towards thinking to the long term, because then we won't put ESG over in this bucket over here. It'll actually be part of business decisions, and that's where we need to get to, in my mind.
Thanks. Robert?
Yeah, and I think we need to go from sort of managing problems to solving problems, and that actually means investing more, because you still have to manage them while you're trying to root cause solve them. And when we're talking about sources of capital, we've been talking about financial capital, Nick, but there's also human capital. Where are we putting our brightest problem solvers? What issues are they really focused on? And then there's political capital in terms of courage. And it's not just political capital for a minister or a prime minister where they're going to invest. Clearly, this government has invested a lot of political capital in women's issues, and I think with great effect, nationally, potentially internationally. But the same thing for a CEO. Where's a CEO going to take risks? Indra Nooyi of Pepsi is very committed to these issues. And when she came in, she wanted to make sure that Pepsi was doing healthier products, less sugar, less salt, making a greater commitment to the community. She pushed so hard she almost lost her job because the investors, yeah, we care about this in the long term, but boy, your last quarter you didn't make. So she had to ratchet back, but she pushed right to the limit. She expended some political capital to see how much of a difference she could make in the world while she was making that difference to the bottom line. And that's the kind of capital we need to do. It's the financial, the human, and the political capital. Those three together will get us to the SDGs.
Thanks for the observation about capital in all its forms. Great one. Thank you. Caroline.
I think specifically from a Canadian perspective is the recognition that there's an ongoing power shift happening within this country, and that power shift is being built on recognition, implementation of Indigenous rights, and that de-risks the relationship, it de-risks the political structures, and it de-risks in the financial facilitation of business and the business success for Indigenous communities. And I think that needs to be a higher place or more central within the narrative of this country.
Thank you. I'm just going to do a time check, and I know we started a couple of minutes late, so I'll indulge the audience, if I may, both live and live streaming, with a couple of more minutes here. We've touched on a range of topics here, and it's not easy to sort of pull this all back together and say, right. But here we are, trustees of $50 to $60 trillion. We've got 15 to 20 years to make our difference. We know it's not a should anymore, it's a must, and above all, we can. What is the final thing you'd want to say to somebody about what is it that we can and must do that will be a game shifter? And Robert, I can see a nice smile on your face. I'm going to pick on you first.
We must persevere. Because the fact is, we've actually made enormous progress over the last 10 or 15 years. Internationally with the Millennium Development Goals, reducing poverty by half. In many developed countries as well. I mean, the progress we've made on clean tech and on new energy sources. And it's too easy when one looks at how daunting the problems are ahead to give up and to therefore reject all the good things we're already doing. So I think we've got to do more and better things, but I think it's also very important to acknowledge the good steps that are actually working right now and persevere in applying them. Because my observation in the world is we tend to overestimate what we can change in the medium term and underestimate or underappreciate what we're going to change in the short term and underestimate what we can achieve in the medium term if we persevere. So perseverance will be key to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals.
Jennifer, what's your last observation there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes for my prior role as head of Women in Capital Markets and for this issue, and to pick up on what you were talking about. These are complex issues. Closing a gender gap in the economy is a complex issue. Fixing, what we've done and transitioning to a low-carbon economy is a complex problem. And it is going to take great leadership and certainly perseverance. And so I think as we continue with this dialogue, we need a recognition of that there's no quick fixes out there. We've got to really think about, be committed to the long term here.
Stephen, the last word to you here.
Well, the last word for me is partnerships. I think that in civil society we can do a lot. We mobilize communities, we generate a lot of ideas, but we can't get where we're going without deeper partnerships with the public sector and the private sector. That, I think, will power the transformative change we need. And I would just add to that, if I may, we need a vision, a practical vision of where we're going. And so selecting among the SDGs which we're going to prioritize and building around those the transition scenarios so that we know 10 years out we need to be here, 2 years out we should be working on this, and by 5 years out we need to be able to count on this being done and to be able to negotiate the trade-offs, the investments in innovation around that kind of a trajectory will actually move this all forward. And we won't spend so much time arguing about this pipeline or not, or this particular issue or not. We have to align around where we want to go, and that requires a different kind of conversation.
Indeed. So it remains for me to perhaps share with you my own quick thought, which is that I think we need a common base of information. That some of us feel great urgency because we see both the SDGs, which keep us up at night perhaps, but we see the impact potential and the opportunity for sustainable finance, which probably gets us out of bed in the morning. When you're aware that 70% of most of the world that will exist in 2030 hasn't been built today, whether it's in Africa or India or in parts of unserved communities in Canada, it's game on, and it remains for me to thank my esteemed panelists for sharing their insights and wisdom with us this morning. This afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nick, for guiding us through that discussion. This has been such an important discussion. We've heard a lot of feedback over the whole of 2017 that we need to be having this conversation about finance, and this is the second panel that I've been privy to in the last couple of months, and so I'd like to see a lot more of this conversation. So don't be surprised if you get some more invitations. Thank you very much again. And for those of you on site, please join us for a coffee reception just outside on the main level where you'll have a chance to continue this conversation. For those online, we hope you continue to explore all the content from earlier this week on wgsi.org and through our partner TVO at tvo.org/WGSI. Thank you to all.